Schneider Electric is proud to bring this podcast to you. Schneider's mission is to be the customer's digital partner for sustainability and efficiency, and bringing insights such as you are about to hear helps further that mission.
My name is Jo Taranto and I'm joined today by Paul Higham, the Head of Strategy and Enterprise Planning with Sydney Water. And we're talking about creating resilient and reliable water supply for Greater Sydney. Thanks so much for joining me, Paul.
Hi, Jo. Well, thanks for being here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Paul, you've worked with Sydney Water for over 13 years. You must have seen some big changes in that time.
Yeah, certainly the industry and the city as a whole has evolved a great deal over that period. I came over from the UK 13 years ago. Sydney Water was ready for change, and the city was evolving, and the last 10 years or so have been really exciting about how the new city will take shape out to 2050, and that's what the Greater Sydney Water Strategy is all about.
So we're here to talk a little bit about that strategy. For those who don't know anything about it, it's a New South Wales government document. Is that how it works?
Yep. So it's a document that's been released by the New South Wales government. It looks at the long-term view and long-term vision of what water will be like for Greater Sydney. It's a 20-year plan with a 40-year vision, and it's been done in partnership with state government through the Department of Planning and Environment, with a number of other agencies involved like ourselves, Water New South Wales, New South Wales Health, and many others, Environment Agency. So it has really been a cross-sector direction.
And Sydney's changing a lot in the next little while, but it's not just thinking about a changing city, it's also thinking about a changing climate. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So not only do we live on the hottest, driest continent in the world, but we are now seeing the impacts of climate change. And you know, we look back 3-4 years ago and we were in a drought situation, and we've had 3 flood situations in recent years that everybody will be aware of around Greater Sydney. So our environment is changing around us. Our city is growing, and with a population served about 5 million people currently, by 2050 that's expected to be in excess of 7 million people, and we will progressively move west as the city grows and expands. So some really changing drivers around what we're looking for a city and for our communities.
How do you then bring a community on board when you're talking about a strategy and a changing approach potentially from a utility? You've got your existing communities, but you've got a whole bunch of new parts of the city. How do you engage and bring your community?
That's a great question, Jo. We've done an awful lot of work. We historically always have engaged with our communities, but particularly over the last 2 years, we've been going through deliberative forums and very broad engagement around what our customers expect and value from us as an organisation and us as an industry. So a lot of conversations around not just the water supply that we get from the tap every day, 365 days a year, but what they expect from healthy waterways or livability and greening, and certainly the growth of climate change. You know, what are our customers' expectations around the role that we play in responding to and managing the consequences of climate change. That rich feedback is coming out of very thorough engagement with our communities. I assure you they're not shy of telling you what they want and what they aspire. What we've got to understand are what are the trade-offs to be able to achieve that ultimately, because certainly for our customers, long-term affordability is also going to be key for society.
We already know that climate change is here. What does, first of all, it look like when you are talking about water resilience and water supply, and what is Sydney Water doing to respond?
So traditionally, our city has relied upon rainfall-dependent sources. So we take 85% of our water from Warragamba and the other dams around the city. We have a rainfall-independent supply in the desalination plant that can provide up to 15% of the city's water demand. But as climate evolves and as climate changes, the reliance on rainfall is going to be harder and harder. And the idea of, in a drought, building more rainfall dependent sources in a drought doesn't make logical sense in the long run, particularly if climate is going to get drier, hotter for longer. So really thinking about how we plan for those rainfall independent water supplies, and considering all options. So not just the desalination, for example, as we've got now, but what are the opportunities with recycled water, and how can we engage with the communities around purified recycled water, for example? What are their opinions? What are their views? Is it something that they would accept in the long run? It's practiced across the world. 35 cities across the world have shown that that's a viable solution. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily viable for Sydney Water's communities. That's what we've got to engage about. But certainly it's something we have to put to them to see their views and get their engagement in that process.
And so that's talking about recycled potable sources for drinking water.
Well, yeah, for drinking water. But it isn't direct to tap. A lot of people think, I'm going to take it straight to tap. It is, treating it to a standard that it could be returned to the environment, so it can then augment the water sources that we already have, and actually making sure that it is rainfall independent.
You've also talked about better integration of water cycle management. For the average person, what does that look like for Sydney Water?
Well, understanding that all water exists in a cycle. So the natural water cycle, it falls in the mountains, falls on the land, flows through the rivers, returns to the ocean, evaporation, and around the cycle goes. The urban water cycle is the same. It's just modified. So we still get rainfall in the mountains, and then we treat that water and we supply it to our customers, and then we collect that water and return it to the environment safely through the treatment of wastewater. Well, actually, how can we make that more circular in nature? We've seen with the storm events of recent years that a lot of water does fall and we can't capture it all. But how can we make better use of that water as well in sort of ensuring the livability and sustainability of our cities? All of that all water scenario, how can we make best use of that, given the aspirations of our communities around a sustainable water supply, a resilient water supply, healthy waterways, all play a role in that. So how do you actually plan with all those waters in mind? And approaching how can you keep more water in the landscape for livability reasons and things like that. So it's how we plan for that broader aspect.
You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Paul Higham from Sydney Water. You've mentioned before livability and waterway health. Some of the work that Sydney Water's been doing is maybe a bit left of field for what the average water utility would think about. But you mentioned a little bit about urban waterways for recreation. I know that Sydney Water's done a lot of work in this space. Why do you want people, swimming and recreating in our waterways?
Well, swimming and recreation is something that our community have said is important to them, particularly recreation. People, over half of our population live west of Parramatta now. So it's an hour's travel to the beaches. People see the nice clean waterways that we've got and they want to recreate in them. So how can we work with our stakeholders? Because we don't do this alone. We work very closely with council entities and other government entities to make that possible. But fundamentally it's about, well, is the water safe? Is the water or the waterway healthy? The main sources of impact on the waterways are historical industry in the catchments and the impacts that had, but also pollution from stormwater sources and wastewater sources. So we have a role in many aspects of that as a direct manager of our wastewater systems and some of our water systems, and working alongside the councils about how can we create amenity for our communities by making sure that those waterways are safe and healthy.
And waterways and water sources play an incredible role in climate change, resilience and adaptation in terms of cooling and greening. How much does that factor into what Sydney Water's been looking at?
Yeah, thinking about how we can keep more water in the landscape is probably the key point here. Western Sydney is often 4-5 degrees hotter than Eastern City because of the waterways that are around the Eastern City, because of the cooling winds off the ocean. As our city progressively moves further west, you're going to move into an environment where those communities become hotter, they become drier. And as they urbanize, you get urban heat island effect and things like that. So how can we actually use water to create economic value, either through collection of stormwater or recycled water for drinking or non-drinking purposes? How can we actually help? We talk about planting a lot of trees. Trees in drought don't necessarily survive if they don't have access to water to be able to keep them green, to keep them cool. So how do we play a role in that cycle going forward, and what services can we offer? Again, always in partnership, because we're not sole on this journey. It's how do we as a city respond to it, and how do we actually make sure that we provide the right services that our communities value.
So how are you working with other parts of government? You mentioned so many different agencies. What does it look like when you are responding to something as big as climate change?
Oh, so we work closely with particularly the Department of Planning, understanding what climate projections are we expected to think about. Obviously there's a lot of information out there globally around what the long-term future is. What we do as an organisation is we plan for various scenarios, because we honestly don't know which one is going to play out, but we've got to be adaptable and resilient to any and all of them. So we work closely with Department of Planning and with our colleagues, particularly in Water New South Wales, to understand what the various scenarios that could play out, and actually how would we then adapt our approaches in order to respond to what we're seeing at any point in time. We share a lot of information around climate impacts, so there's some really good modelling out there around rainfall events, around dry weather periods, and also things like coastal inundation, sea level rise, and things like that. So actually sharing that knowledge to be able to learn from each other and adapt and respond to each other's thinking is critical to a long-term success. It is a partnership. And making sure that we don't develop plans in isolation of what others are thinking.
Sydney Water has adopted a net zero emissions target for 2030, Paul, and you've got a pretty ambitious circular economy program as well. You frame these as opportunities, and what does it mean for Sydney Water and I guess for your existing assets as well?
Yeah, so when we think about climate change, we think about two aspects. Adaptation. How do we adapt our existing infrastructure to respond to whatever climate change will bring? And abatement is what is our role in actually supporting the change of managing the climate change as it evolves. So when we talk about abatement, we're thinking about things like net carbon zero. What activities can we undertake? How do we reduce our carbon emissions as an organisation? Servicing a population of 5 million people with water every day is quite an energy intensive operation, because we have to pump the water around and we have to collect it and take it back and treat it. So thinking about how we manage our energy sources, where we get them from. We already produce about 20% of our own energy through renewable energy sources. What does it mean to expand that kind of operation and make sure that we can achieve that through solar, wind, hydro? What does that mean in the future? So certainly an aspect of that, and also optimizing. Technology's evolved, and technology will continue to evolve around how we manage our water and wastewater systems. So what can we benefit from there? On the adaptation side, as I was saying in the last question, how do we respond to the various scenarios? Get our assets ready. It could be worse or better than the projections. So how do we actually not overinvest for the really worst scenario, but be flexible enough to be able to respond should it arrive? And that's the real thinking that we're doing around the adaptation thinking in climate change.
Paul, increasingly the industry is acknowledging and respecting First Nations connection to water. How is Sydney Water approaching this when it comes to planning?
So yeah, really good question. We start with the position that our First Nations communities have been managing land and water for 60,000 years and beyond, and they've been doing that sustainably. So there's a lot we can learn about how they think, about how those things integrate. So through our Reconciliation Action Plan, throughout our organisation, we're thinking about how we can bring that knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders into our planning processes. But we start internally initially, so about cultural awareness and getting people aware of what have those communities done and how do they think about the value of water, sweet water and salt water in their case, and how we consider that. And that's been a really strong journey about how we engage with the First Nations community, because we've got to give people the tools to do that. We're thinking about actually how we can support those communities through procurement participation act practices and engagement through those processes. We have really close engagement with local Aboriginal land councils and language groups. And we ask them to participate in our asset planning, to think about the cultural aspects, to think about what the perception is and the historic connection with the place. I mean, I have personal experience with the land council down in the Illawarra, where we were doing a piece of work and the facility was in the facility of former shell beds. So actually, how do we engage and understand the historic significance of that location and plan with that in mind to make sure that we're considering the needs of those communities? And fundamentally, we are progressing things like cultural participation. So one of the things that we've learned in recent years around land management is actually the value of cultural burns. Not from just the cultural aspect, however, it is actually a better and more efficient way of doing it. So actually involving in those practices, and we've done some cultural burns within the Warragamba catchment that reduces bushfire risk, reduces impact on the community, reduces the actual whole effect of smoke in the environment. So actually thinking about what we can learn and what we can take from their experiences and embedding it in how we plan our infrastructure for the growing city is critical for the future. It really does create really positive value for us.
I've been speaking with Paul Higham, Head of Strategy and Enterprise Planning with Sydney Water. Thank you so much for your time, Paul.
That was great, Jo. Thank you so much for inviting me along. Really appreciate it.